So we often hear this term, getting closure, whether it's about, um, something that's happened, a loss, a breakup. We want closure. We want to wrap it up. And it's a psychological term that refers to our wish for a firm, clear answer to a dilemma that we're dealing with. Or maybe another way of thinking of it is as a peaceful resolution to a question or a problem is a way to avoid or avert ambiguity. But given what we talk about here often and what the Dharma offers about uncertainty and controlling the future, the question becomes, is this even achievable? Is wanting closure not simply grasping and clinging to the wish that the situation will resolve to our satisfaction or that the situation will turn out to be different than it's turning out to be? And while that's unsatisfactory, obviously, because it leaves sort of loose ends hanging, I'm going to suggest that, we don't need or even can we obtain closure in order to move on. Is closure not just another story that we tell ourselves to wrap up all the loose ends in a tight, nice little bow? Is it not the case that when we cling to the past, longing for closure, that we simply perpetuate our own suffering? I want closure, I haven't gotten it, and I continue to hold out the hope or the belief that I'm going to get it. Is closure just another way of trying to fix our regrets or, resolve our unfinished business? But let me suggest that if we move on and be grateful for the experience, leave it behind, let it go, and then return to the present moment. Focus on everything we have for which we're grateful. Let go of things which can't necessarily be wrapped up in a nice package. I'm suggesting that we don't need closure to move on. We simply need to move on. So let's dig a little deeper into this notion of closure. So in psychology, we talk about a need as a motivated tendency to get information or to gain some understanding. And one way of defining closure is the motivation to find an answer to an ambiguous or uncertain situation. This is enhanced by this imagined or perceived benefits of obtaining closure. Such as an increased ability to predict the future. Sometimes, well, if I figure this out, then I'll know how to avoid it or head it off in the next occurrence. But the motivation is enhanced by the perceived cost of lacking closure. So, we think it's just going to be terrible if we don't get it. Because we have to deal with the uncertainty, we have to deal with the anxiety which accompanies it. That's our fear, I think, that often motivates us to seek closure. But the problem is a sense of closure is not usually possible with losses, such as the death of a loved one. I mean, we just don't wrap that up. There's a mismatch there between what we hope will happen if we achieve closure and what we actually experience. There's the notion of closure being a myth. There's a disconnect between what we think will happen or want or hope to happen and what actually happens. And in psychology, we talk about the need of closure resulting from two general tendencies, and we've been able to tease these out. The first one is what's been called the urgency tendency, okay? And that's the inclination to obtain closure as quickly as possible. I want it now because that will reduce my anxiety, that will reduce the ambiguity, that will reduce the uncertainty, the urgency tendency. And the other tendency is what we call the permanence tendency, the tendency to maintain that closure, that illusion of closure, for as long as possible. Now, the urgency tendency is a result of a lack of discernment, seeing things clearly, and a lack of patience. I can't wait, I need it right now. And the permanence tendency is a result of denying impermanence and clinging to a specific belief. I need to see this as a permanent resolution. Well, that flies in the face of what we know about impermanence. And what happens when we invoke those two tendencies, and we do this without conscious awareness usually, is we reduce the information processing and introduce biases into our thinking. Okay, so in other words, we're seeing things as we want them to be, not as they are, which we talk about all the time. Seeing things as we want them to be, not as they are, is a guaranteed source of suffering. Okay. Because the reality is there are things in our lives that we never get over. They may lessen in intensity, but I mean, I can remember the first breakup with my girlfriend in high school, and if I really think about it, it can still evoke a little bit of hurt. Um, so there was no closure there. There was a lessening of the pain, but it's still hanging around if I think about it. The Dharma asks us to accept things as they truly are. But the lack of closure leaves the situation in ambiguity. And as we talk about frequently, we don't like it. We dislike ambiguity, we dislike uncertainty. This is why we have a high need for closure. And we seek it by avoiding the ambiguity, trying to avoid the ambiguity and the uncertainty. We want to wrap it up, which usually means kidding ourselves with unrealistic thoughts and beliefs. Whatever benefits there are from seeking closure, which, and relating it to predictability, has no basis in reality. A high need for closure brings about this tendency to jump to conclusions, to form knowledge more quickly. It opens us up to a tendency to prefer black and white answers, cut and dried outcomes, which is not skillful. We have to learn to be with the ambiguity, with the uncertainty. And this is where I think a lot of, real rigid ethical views, real rigid values, real rigid religious beliefs come from, this need for closure. So not only is it not possible, seeking it just perpetuates our suffering as we keep hope alive. Well, sooner or later, I'm going to get it. I know it's hard now, but if I just wait, But remember that our practice points us toward accepting all of life, the 10,000 joys and the 10,000 sorrows. I see this, some of I facilitate a child loss bereavement group and have for about 5 years. And I see all the time in there that closure never happens. And we spend a lot of time in the group addressing that. Now, the people that lost a kid 10 years ago have gained greater acceptance of that loss. But that loss will never go away, and they will tell you that. The people that just lost a child, I mean, they are acutely in the midst of that painful loss, and they would love closure. But part of what the message from the group members is, listen, you're not going to get it. You have to accept the loss and then just work with that, be with that, show up for that. They accept that grief will lessen, but it will never go away. It's a perfect example of why this idea of closure is a myth. Because only by embracing reality do we avoid the second arrow stories that we're weak or defective because we're still grieving, on and on and on, just more suffering. And this is true for any loss or any traumatic event. So I just want to leave you with the thought that closure doesn't happen. It's a myth. Even though we long for it, we seek it, we pursue it, but it just perpetuates our suffering. So let me leave it there.